Welcome to the Real About Real Estate podcast with Michelle Hayward. Get the latest information meant for buyers and sellers straight from real people in the industry.
Hello, viewers and listeners. Thank you for joining me today in today's podcast. I have to start off by saying today's podcast is not about one of my favorite topics. It is pretty sensitive in nature, has a lot of sadness surrounding it, and that is about divorce. Many of us may know of someone who's been divorced. You may have been divorced, and it affects everyone differently, as well as those connected to you. Our topic today specifically is, what if your spouse says, I want the house in the divorce? How do you handle that? For starters, the good thing is that the divorce rate has come down over the last several years. The sad thing is that divorces still happen. But the fact that they've come down a lot is, again, a good thing. They are still high compared to the 1970s. As I mentioned, everyone handles divorces differently. But for our purpose today, we will be talking about how does divorce and real estate tie in together when the spouse wants the house in a divorce. I also want to preface it by saying I am not an attorney. So anything that I cover in this podcast is based on either experience, research, or just, again, the nature of what we unfortunately get to see and witness day in and day out. So with that, it starts with community property. And some of you may have heard that term before. It varies by state. So when you're talking about community property, it comes down to assets and debts that are acquired during the marriage are owned jointly and will be divided approximately equally. And I say approximately equally, and it's certainly a topic that we can talk a little bit more about, but as I mentioned, you want to consult an attorney and do your own research. We want to stick to the topic at hand today and not get too sidetracked, but just so you have a basic understanding of community property, that is what it means. And every state has their own kind of jurisdiction and how they handle things, and they're governed by those laws. So here in Arizona, we are a community property state, and there are 9 community property states. Some of them, aside from Arizona, are California, Idaho, Louisiana, to name a few. And there's something called equitable distribution, which is the other way that assets and debts are divided up. But today, specifically, we're going to talk about community property since I am here in Arizona. So one of the things that I want to mention is that the state laws do, again, govern community property. But if you are in the military, you also have federal laws that govern divorces. So you have the federal and the state. There are exclusions under the community property laws, and those exclusions are if they're gifts or inheritance. So under those two, those can be excluded from community property. One other point I want to mention is that if property is owned, or really any assets are owned, assets and debts are owned prior to the marriage, those are yours independent of the marriage. So we're only talking about marital assets and debt acquired during the marriage. So I want to make sure I emphasize that for clarity for this discussion here. So now getting into the spouse wanting the house in a divorce. There's so many factors to consider. And we won't have time to cover all of those today, but I assure you that I will talk about those in upcoming podcasts. So I hope you will continue to listen and watch for those. But many people say, okay, well, I want the house. And in this case, based on our topic, the spouse says, I want the house in a divorce. But unfortunately, it's not that easy. It's not just about the title, it's about the mortgage. So the title gives you the rights to the property. The mortgage is based on whose name or names are on that loan. When the lender loaned those funds to you to get your property, that is who the lender is expecting to repay that debt. So even if you want, one spouse takes their name off the title, you've simply just given up your rights, but you still have to pay that debt. And so now what does that look like in the case of a couple who's amicable? That would be the hope in such a trying time and trying situation, is that the couple can be amicable, that you can talk about, what will happen with the property and agree on what will happen with the property before you file. Because once you file, you've now introduced a third party into the transaction, which sometimes, if you don't agree on what's going to happen, the courts make the decision for you. So the better way to handle things is, accept, as much as you can, the situation, and focus on what really needs to happen with that property, and what's in the best interest of your family, particularly if there are children involved. So when it comes to that house and the spouse who wants to keep the house, one of the things that have to be considered is that spouse in a position, a financial position, to maintain the mortgage, the maintenance on the property, taxes, insurance. And so it goes beyond, again, just wanting the house. You have to be able to afford the house. Because remember, when you go through a divorce and those assets and debts are being divided by the courts, you ultimately have to look at what your position will be on one income versus two. So when it comes to that mortgage, you not only have that debt, but you have the other factors that come along with owning the house. And so sometimes it may come down to refinancing the property as an option to keep it. And what does refinancing mean? In the case of a divorce, it means that you are taking the equity, and I want to make sure I touch on what equity is for clarification. So that is the value of the home minus what you owe on the property. That is your equity. And so you're taking that equity along with that debt that still has to be paid. So let's say the equity is 100,000 and your outstanding balance is also 100,000. Your property has to list for more than $200,000. And so those are the things that you need to consider is, when we list the property, are we listing it at a value that's going to be high enough for me to be able to pay my spouse 50% of this equity? So in this case, it would be $50,000 that you would be paying to the other spouse to buy them out. In some cases, you have where, if the couple is in agreement, that the spouse who wants to keep the home, as long as the house can, the spouse can maintain the financial situation of the home and the upkeep and everything, that may be okay. That might be what's agreed until you can buy the other person out. Or if you're not in a position to financially maintain the property, but you agree that the party that can't afford to keep the property right now, the other spouse is agreeing to pay that mortgage and maybe the upkeep and other things. That's considered a spousal maintenance, also known as alimony. And so, if the other party who is in a financial position to help the spouse who's not in a financial position but who chooses to stay in the home, as long as you have that agreement and the courts have put that on record as to, because everything goes on record. Once you file, everything goes on record from that point forward as to who is supposed to do what and the time frame of when everything is supposed to take place. But let's say you can't refinance, the other spouse is not in a position, or you're not in a position to financially maintain that home. Sometimes the only option is to sell the property. And that means now you have to talk to a realtor in addition to your divorce attorney, who's really guiding you through this whole process as to what does the list price look like and timeline, because you're in a unique situation different than someone else who's looking to list their property. So again, those are things that you want to consider. The only other way to avoid a default on the property, which is defaulting on the loan to the lender, is quite often to sell the property. That way, you don't have that as a concern. Now, I'm not an advocate of divorce. I do understand that it is unique circumstances around divorce. And again, everybody's situation is different. But I want to make sure that I am providing information to you that is helpful, even in some small way, if you are contemplating a divorce or already have filed for a divorce, that you understand some of the things surrounding what your options are when it comes to your home. There are different resources that are out there. And when it comes to looking at, are you in a financial position to keep the house, you definitely want to talk to a lending professional. So, a mortgage lender that can help you and look at your situation post divorce. Because keep in mind, we're talking about it from a standpoint of the divorce is finalized and what does your financial position look like at that time, not as it is today. So once all the assets and debts have been divided, can you still maintain that property? And so the lender is going to look at all of that and be able to help you and devise a plan and see what your buying power might be if you're looking to buy another property. Let's say you're the spouse who's looking to move on, or if you're the one who's looking to stay. Again, that financial professional is going to help you in both of those scenarios. But when you decide, or if you decide that you don't want the property, whether it's one or both, those are the things that you have to consider. And sometimes it comes down to there are just too many memories in a home that you once shared together as a family. So neither party may want the home. So then you know that the only situation that you would find yourself in is to sell the property at that time. So again, the conversation has to be had with one another, hopefully before you've filed. If not, certainly very close to after filing and having that conversation with your attorneys if you have attorneys present. I will certainly be covering other topics a little bit more in depth surrounding this because, again, of time's sake, I know there's a lot of things to be unpacked here, and there may be questions that you might have. And like I said, it can't be covered in a short podcast. But my hope today is that you've gained some insight that will help you move forward separate of one another and can just make the best out of this, as much of a smooth transition for each of you as you possibly can. And on a good note, one of my conversations this morning was about gratitude, and I will end it on gratitude. And that is just being grateful for the small things, things that we take for granted. And even though this may be a tough time for you and your family and what you're going through, my hope is that you will find some bright light in it and that you can go about your day and your life with peace and positivity. Have a great day.
Thank you for tuning into the Real About Real Estate podcast with Michelle Hayward. Like, follow, and subscribe to continue to get the real about real estate.